Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
Hello, I'm Shonali Bhattacharya. Thanks for joining us today at a big time to find a bigger tent. I'm a playwright and activist and secretary and London regional rep on Momentum's National Coordinating Group. At the 2019 general election, the Conservative Party achieved 43.6% of the popular vote, the highest percentage of any party since 1979. This electoral coalition has been decades in the making. The Conservatives have increased their share of the vote in every election since 2005. In contrast, Labour's vote share declined considerably between 1997 and 2015. Although Labour's surge at the 2017 general election seemed to point to the possibility of building a social majority for radical socio-economic reforms, the result in December revealed the fragility of Labour's electoral coalition. How do we build beyond the 10 million people who voted for Corbyn while also winning the 120 seats Labour require for a working majority? What groups does Labour need to win? What are the tensions between these different groups and what politics will it take to unite them? How do we ensure the gains we've made aren't jettisoned when the need for a new social contract is starker than ever in the face of this devastatingly mishandled pandemic? At Momentum, we've been grappling with the questions of our role post-Corbyn. As part of the new National Coordinating Group, we were elected on a platform of reorientation towards grassroots campaigning and community and workplace organising, as well as building the socialist left within the Labour Party in a bid to sustain and grow a broad-based movement. Today, I'm joined by a great panel of speakers to discuss how we can build a bigger tent. But before we begin, we have a few rules of engagement. We want everyone to feel welcome in these spaces and for everyone's voices to be heard. So please bear this in mind when engaging with chat or comment boxes during sessions. Please don't use inappropriate, rude or unkind language, and please don't spam. Participants who violate these principles may be prevented from further posting in the chat and comment boxes. In this session, we'll be using a live transcription service called Otter. Attendees using Otter will have to follow a link and open the transcript as a separate window. The link will be shared in the chat box by a tech volunteer. If you're having difficulties, please message the tech volunteer on the chat. The World Transformed is free for all, but it's only made possible by the contributions of our supporters. If you're able to, please consider supporting us at theworldtransformed.org/support to help us sustain our work all year round. So without further ado, let's go on to our fabulous panel today. Today we've got speaking Paul Mason, who's a journalist, filmmaker and author of Clear Bright Future, a radical defence of the human being. Also Hazel Nolan, who's a GMB Scotland organiser. Prior to working for GMB, Hazel was the national organiser for Hope Not Hate. While working for GMB Scotland, Hazel led on the successful Glasgow Equal Pay campaign and the worker occupation battle for BIFAB. Andrew Murray is Chief of Staff of Unite, advisor to Jeremy Corbyn and author of The Fall and Rise of the British Left. We're now going to hear from each of our speakers and then we'll have a discussion and you'll have a chance to ask any questions. Do post questions in the chat and our volunteers will collect them. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Paul.
Well, thanks for that, and congratulations to TWT for what's been a fantastic festival of ideas so far. I think let's start from what are we trying to achieve? For me, what we're trying to achieve is what I call a left government. That is a government that breaks with the neoliberal economic model, that decarbonizes the economy over 2 terms if possible, so you get to zero net carbon in 10 years in power, and radically redistributes political power. So that's what I think we should be trying to achieve. There's lots of other things you can bolt onto it, but I think that's the basic. Now, for me, I think that's possible. One of the byproducts of achieving a left government would be a revived space for civil society activism, for trade unionism, for struggles of communities, which, as we know, are being completely crushed by the relentlessness, I suppose, of the neoliberal crisis and regime. But as with my political hero, Antonio Gramsci, we have to start from a rigorous assessment of the political dynamics of now, what Gramsci called the conjuncture. And I think there are two facts that sort of stand in our way for getting the kind of government that we want. One, there is a big, and I think unfortunately it's even now growing, socially conservative movement among especially older white English and Welsh people in ex-industrial communities. That is a big thing. Bigger than that is that I think Scotland is on a trajectory for leaving the UK. When I covered the 2014 referendum, I met 16-year-old school students who said things like to me like, I'm for independence, even though I support the wrong football team. That is, they were Rangers fans, and they were surrounded by not just unionists, but loyalists, but they were still pro-independence. I think all the polling is moving towards that. Now, whether we find ourselves inside a non-UK, so just England and Wales and Northern Ireland, whatever that would feel like, or whether Scotland stays and we've got to face up to and defeat and if possible fragment this reactionary movement. It may be, and this is the problem, it may be we have to settle for something less than a left-wing Labour government. That is, for something that simply defeats and resists authoritarian conservatism plus fascism. So I think, however, it is possible that we get a left government. And I think the way to it is, first of all, understanding that what's changed. I think after 2010, there was this possibility opened up for, again, what Gramsci called a war of maneuver. So the elite embrace austerity, massive austerity, and this really shatters the whole centre-left social democracy. And whether it's like what we did, we all joined, or many people joined Labour, or, for example, if you look at Syriza, which became a hybrid party between the far left and the social democracy, or a form alliance like the Bloco in Portugal and the Socialist Party. What opened up was the possibility of a big anti-austerity struggle creating a left government. I think what we're up against now is something new. These are not authoritarian nationalist neoliberals have a different project. They are not primarily about austerity. It's about a national form of neoliberalism where they break up the global system. So they will borrow money like Trump, and they will print money like Trump to fuel what they need to do. They won't provide public services, but the imperative of austerity is for now not there. Now, the other obstacle, so the other change that we've got to take account of, I think, however you read the 2019 election result, a lot of the pollsters say it was coming over 10 years. It's not just Brexit. It's not just Ed Miliband or Corbyn. It's a 10 plus year divergence of working class experience between, my favorite contrast, because I do this journey regularly, is from Euston Station to Wigan Station. It takes 2 hours, less than 2 hours sometimes. So from Camden to Wigan, it's a completely different reality. When you get a train in Wigan, the most obvious thing is there's no money in the town. There's no higher education either. In Lee, where I come from, which part of Wigan, there's no post-16 education in the town. The demographic structure is completely different. Now, Camden is a working class borough. Camden is poorer than Wigan, just on the government's measures. But Wigan's and places like it are suffering so much worse. Now, this is the basis for what Starmer's Chief of Policy, Claire Ainsley, calls the difference between the new and traditional working class. As labels, I don't like new versus traditional working class. I believe there's only one working class, but we have to acknowledge that the experience is divergent. I think what has the Labour leadership decided to do to try and solve this problem. This is not necessarily my solution, but I think we, the left, have to map on what we're doing to what Starmer, etc., have decided to do. It is this. If you look at Claire's basic sort of solution to this, it is try and focus on the values that both, as it were, sides of the culture war within the working class share. And these are listed as, quote, family, fairness, hard work, and decency. Now, a lot of us on the radical left, on the socially liberal side of the left, when we look at those words, some of them don't resonate very well with us. But I think if we don't look at them as values, but we look at them as a collective survival mechanism, you know, if there's no society, you fall back on family. If you can't struggle collectively, at least you can struggle individually for a fair deal at work. Hard work, I think, is what people mean by, you know, they don't like people who don't work, like the elite. And as for decency, I mean, I think, you know, everybody who's experienced that collapse under neoliberalism of solidarity, was you saw my father's generation try to just maintain what they could when they were being made to, you know, eat dirt in the labor exchange during the Thatcher era. What we've got to do, I think, is move, and here's where I think we differ from what Lotto and what the soft left are doing at the moment in Labour. So I think what they see is we can bring a solution based on these values. It's classic Fabianism. It's from above. You hear a lot of talk about the foundational economy, about, you know, decent work. Personally, my long-term aim is for a post-work economy, and I think they're going to try and integrate the decarbonisation offer into a wider social offer rather than package it as a Green New Deal. Now, whether or not we like all that, that is what I think they're going to do. The different emphasis I think the left can bring, and I will wind up here, is that I think, first of all, we are not just about surviving under neoliberalism. We're about abolishing neoliberalism, attacking capitalism. So I want to go into those struggles around family, fairness, hard work, decency, etc., the struggles at work, the struggles in communities, and turn them into from survival to resistance. I think that's what the left strategy should be. I think that strategy can be done with inside the party, above all, because the party is a very important vehicle for bringing these two separate experiences of the working class together into one entity. There's very few other things. Trade unions a bit, but, you know, community campaigns differ very greatly from places like Wigan to Camden. So the party can be the place where people meet. And what can we say to people? I think it is there are two watchwords that I think we can bring that I think the centre left and the soft left don't really get. One is, I think what links the struggles of people in Camden and Wigan is they're struggling against powerlessness, the absence of power in their lives. And if they've got nothing else in common, you can say to them, look, the absence of power in your life is what you actually share. And here as a party, we're going to try and empower you so that you can fight for your own things. The second one is social justice. Social justice is a very deeply embedded framework in both these kind of communities that I think we can give a content to. To finish, I've seen Glenn Beck in America spend hours trying to tell people that social justice is communism. And the reason the far right do this is because they know that even amongst communities that are very susceptible to their propaganda, you know, the classic small town mid-American place that has its mirror here in Britain, things like Catholic social teaching, the social teaching of Islam, the social teaching of basically liberal society tells people that there should be social justice. So I think that is a powerful frame for us. But I'll finish by saying I don't think anything about what we have to do is going to be easy. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. So we'll hear from Hazel Nolan now, GMB Scotland organiser, How to Build a Bigger Tent. So Paul's suggesting that Labour can offer an alternative model of empowerment and social justice to ordinary people. Do you think that's possible, Hazel?
I think it has to be possible, and if it's not, then I don't think we stand a chance, quite frankly. I'm not Scottish, as you might have guessed from my accent, but I have been living here since 2015, and I just wanted to pick up to start with on some of the comments that Paul made about Scotland, because what happened in 2014, from my experience and my reflections on it, is that you had a group of people who wanted social change, and we lost the ability to convince them that Labour was the vehicle to deliver that. The SNP, what they did successfully is they convinced people that independence was the route to get there. And I think the Labour Party up here made a tragic and a consequential mistake, in that we started to tell people, actually it's not possible. These problems aren't possible. We should have spent that time on that platform going around saying this vision that the SNP are painting of a better Scotland is something that you do deserve and you can have. And the way to get there is to vote for a Labour government. But instead we spent too long telling them things like, oh, well, actually it's not so bad here. And we ran a negative campaign, and we've long-term consequences of that. The reality of where we need to be, I think, is that, we need to build a coalition. We need to meet people where they are, and everyone in the movement, and the Labour movement, needs to play their part. So on the issue of building coalitions, yes, we need a coalition of the working class. I feel very similar to what Paul said, in that I don't like to create differences, but the reality is people do have different lived experiences. And if we look back at 2017 and the election result there, we did really, really well in some areas. We ran a great campaign. But what we needed to do was we needed to not only just win Canterbury and Kensington, we also needed to win Mansfield. And we didn't spend enough time after 2017 focusing on why did we lose Mansfield, instead of just why did we win Kensington and Canterbury. And I think the difference in why we win some areas and lose some does come down to people's lived experiences. Because if you're poor in a metropolitan area like London, and I lived in London for 5 years before I moved up to Scotland, you're angry. It makes you angry because you can see the wealth in the country every day. It is absolutely in your face. I actually sometimes go back to London. It makes me feel uncomfortable because you see the wealth. It's all around you and you have no access to it. But if you live in somewhere like Mansfield, or in an area of deindustrialization in the UK, which is most of our heartlands, you don't get angry because there's no wealth in your community. What there is there's the local factory closing down, and your children are given the option of either moving down somewhere like London or Manchester, or moving away to a big city, or they get a job maybe working in a call center. And I think we don't have enough appreciation, or we didn't show enough appreciation for the emotional reaction that causes in people. When I introduce myself, I say, hi, I'm Hazel Nolan, I'm a trade unionist. It's not just a thing that I do, it's a part of who I am. And so these communities aren't just losing jobs. It's not just that they're out of pocket, it's that they're losing their sense of identity, and to a large extent their sense of purpose. And that emotional reaction and that difference, that does capture a different consequence. And I think that what it is, the Tories, they understood that, and they gave a message that actually offered hope. I think we need to realize that in the States, Make America Great Again, that was a slogan that gave a lot of people a lot of hope. Brexit, take back control, that was a message of hope to those communities. So what was our message of hope to people? I think, electorally, we're entering a stage where baby boomers, for example, for the first time, no longer have a sole block vote on in voting in the elections, right? Like before, up until recently, if you appeal to baby boomers, you either won or lost the election. And that's starting to change. And so it is important that Labour reaches out to younger people. But we need to focus more on how do we build that coalition. And I think areas like care are going to be extremely important in the future, because that's something that elderly voters are going to need more of. There's people who are in that age group who are getting stuck in a care trap because they are, one, going to need care for themselves, their elderly parents are in care, or two, they're also having to compensate for childcare for their younger children as well. We can match that need for care and come up with collectivized solutions to those problems, such as talking about good quality in care, and COVID-19 also presents loads of opportunities for us to do this as well. But I mean, Labour's offer at the moment on good paid care jobs is still lower than what you would earn in Lidl. And I think that's a huge problem. And the other thing is that we need to meet people where they are. You know, I was very excited about the idea of a Green New Deal. That was our flagship policy when it came to the last election. But we focused too narrowly on one aspect of that, and that was about the environmental crisis. And I am absolutely not here to deny that we have environmental crisis. We 100% do, but we also have a jobs crisis, and we didn't talk enough about that aspect of that policy. And to give you an example of that, you know, in Scotland in 2010, we were promised that Scotland would be the Saudi Arabia of renewables jobs. And 10 years later, it turns out that Saudi Arabia is the Saudi Arabia of renewables jobs, because we are losing contract after contract to yards in China and the UAE and other Middle Eastern countries when it comes to fabrication work. And that's affecting loads of G&B members and Unite members. We were promised 20,000 jobs in the renewable sector, and the reality is there's less than 1,000. It's not just on construction. It's, you know, this is also affecting CS Wind. It's affecting members. It's, you know, in Alexander Dennis as well. We talk about building renewable public transport models. The reality is it's just absolutely not happening, and we're not doing enough to call out the jobs aspect of that. And that's where our members are. You know, we ended up occupying the yards at BIFAP in 2017 along with Unite, at the same time that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, was at a conference in Bonn on renewables. I mean, the irony of that is stark. And if Labour wants to win, we have to accept that reality, you know, and we have to talk about those things, talk about jobs for people, good paying jobs, because, you know, I think Paul mentioned the issue of fairness. That is what a lot of people are looking for. They're just looking for a fair crack of the whip, and they don't have it. And we're not talking about that at all. And that reality is about meeting voters where they are. And, you know, in 2017, we ran a really good campaign. We ran an emotional campaign, and we had a slogan for hope. But instead of building on that, we didn't. In 2019, our campaign slogan was very vacuous and empty. You know, real change. Like, what does that mean? It didn't mean, you know, anything for people. You talk about for the many, not the few. I know what that means. And to give an example of why that's so important, you know, when we had the whole immigration debate in the UK, do people remember that photograph of that little boy that washed up on that beach? Because I remember it. And I remember the whole commentary at the time just kind of stopped just for a few moments, because that tapped into something in people. And then again, you know, we still have really negative, and the British press is terrible at this, debate about immigration. But that personal touch, that resonated with people for a moment. And that's one of the most powerful things that we have in the Labour movement and the Labour Party, is that connection, is that sense of community, are those really deep rooted feelings that people have. And we spend so long in most debates and in most election campaigns talking nonstop instead about, you know, statistics and figures that don't resonate with people whatsoever. And actually the irony is that it is the right who talk about values. And I do think that is an important thing that we need to do. You know, we need to meet people where they are with that. And absolutely everyone needs to play their part. And I think the reality is that, you know, in terms of how trade unions relate to the Labour Party, well, we have our part to play there as well, because the Labour Party could do a lot better out of us if we could convince all of our members to vote Labour instead of just handing over checks when it comes to election time. But the reality is that the trade union movement as well needs to re-establish a lot of our links with members on the shop floor, because you need to earn the right to talk to workers firstly before we can earn the right to tell them how to vote in elections. And the reality is that in a lot of areas, we're not doing that as well as we should be. So I think those are my main comments and observations. Is that, yeah, we need to talk to people where they are, and we do need to build coalitions and realize that people's experiences are different, and how do we resonate and build on that? Because there's nothing more powerful than talking about that. And when we ran the BIFAP campaign, I asked all the workers, what does this mean for you? Because I knew they were going to get swept under a tide of people talking about the statistics, the complexities of the situation, and how much the money was involved in the project and everything else. And and I don't want to get their emotional stories out. And I asked one guy, I said to him, what does this place being open mean for you? And he said, well, I'm a scaffolder and I've had to travel all over the UK and all over the world trying to get work. And sometimes I'm away from my family for weeks and months on end. And BIFAB being open means that I get to tuck my 7-year-old kid into bed every night. And I remember when we won that campaign, and I messaged the members and I messaged the reps and said, you know, we've won. I wanted them to hear it from us instead of hearing it on the airwaves. And they said to me, I hope you're celebrating. And I said, yeah, of course I am. I'm sending a selfie with myself in the pub with a few of the other organisers celebrating the fact that we'd won the campaign. And one of the guys wrote back to me and said, this is me celebrating. And he was tucking his 7-year-old kid into bed. And I think that's powerful. And I think that we need to take that emotional reaction that people feel and respond to that and listen to that and put that forefront. You know, this week there was a £3 billion project for offshore wind in Scotland, and not a single job is going to be created on the back of it in Scotland in fabrication because all the contracts were awarded abroad. And we need to talk about that. And we need to talk about jobs, and we need to talk about communities. And I think that's the way that we can unite, and that we need to win Mansfield and we need to win Kensington if we want to win a general election. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Hazel. I just want to remind everyone, if you've got any comments or particularly any questions for our brilliant speakers today, please put them in the chat and we will be able to get to some of those later. So yeah, if anything is resonating with you, you want to bring anything up, then please do that. So next we've got Andrew Murray. So yeah, it'd be great to hear from you, Andrew. So Hazel's sort of putting forward this question: why are Labour values not resonating with the public, and why didn't that happen in 2019 when it did in 2017? It'd be great to hear from you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to the World Transformed for organising this event today. And let me say, I really agree, I think, with everything that Paul and Hazel have already said. Now, I think, Shonali, you perhaps slightly undersold the Tory achievement in saying they'd increased their vote from 2005. I think it is the case. They've increased their share of the vote in every election since the sort of low point of 1997. They've gone over that period from around 28, 29% to 44% in terms of share of the vote. That's taken them 6 elections. Our objective now has to be to try and get to 44% from 32% in one election, really, in a period of 4 years. So it's a formidable challenge to get to that sort of, you know, numbers that don't just win you an election but give you a real mandate to make changes. But I think 2017 did show that it's not unreachable, because that represented a 10% increase in Labour's share of the vote relative to 2015, just 2 years earlier. Now, it's true that the only elections that really matter are the last one and the next one. But nevertheless, I think 2017 shouldn't be written out of our historical recollection, because we did get over 40% of the vote, and that's only the 3rd time the Labour Party's done that since 1970. Before 1970, win or lose, Labour always got more than 40% of the vote since the Second World War. Only happened 3 times since Blair's first 2 elections and 2017. And if one thinks about how that was achieved, and it was an achievement in the sense we won Canterbury, we won Kensington, and in most red wall seats, so-called red wall seats, we had the best vote we've had this century in terms of absolute numbers, although there was already a tightening, as what I think Paul rightly describes as a social conservatism in many of those seats started to mean UKIP votes going back to the Tories, and so majorities were getting tighter. But I think one thing which I think is relevant to our immediate prospects with Labour now is that in that campaign there was something that was the same as there was in 1964 when Wilson was elected, and 1997 when Blair was first elected, and I think probably in 1945 too. There was an air of political excitement around the Labour campaign. There was a vision of things changing that could catch up people coming at it from different perspectives somewhat in different parts of the country behind a programme for change that was, you know, radical enough to make a difference but credible enough to be plausible. And that air of excitement is something that if we lose, we're going to find it much harder to win in the next general election campaign. And I would agree with Lotto and Keir that it's too early or it's unnecessary to have detailed policies this far ahead of any likely general election. But it's not too early to be starting to work on setting out that vision that can not just bring a sufficiently large coalition together, but can infuse it with a sense of excitement and possibility. The pandemic has strengthened the case for the sort of changes that Labour was arguing for under Jeremy. And I think Keir has so far focused on a contrast of competence, which is absolutely fine. He's only going to win that argument. But to give some idea as to how Labour will build Britain back better, to use the ubiquitous slogan now, what does Labour mean by that in terms of inequality, in terms of poverty, the role of the state, green growth? What indeed does it mean in terms of deepening democracy? I think those issues where it's not too early for the Labour front bench to be really trying to set out what its aims and its values are. And I think one lesson we have to learn, it has to be the same vision everywhere. I mean, I noticed, and when I criticise things that happened under Jeremy's leadership, I have to own to part of the mistakes as I was there. But I noticed in 2019, we were very much talking to part of the country, what one might call for the convenient shorthand, the metropolitan progressive part of our coalition, in terms of values. We were trying to talk to the traditional working class, I mean, I don't like the term either, but for shorthand, in terms of pounds, shillings and pence. Like we knew we couldn't talk to them in terms of values, so we made transactional offers that we hoped would get us over that hump. It didn't work, and I think in the future there has to be a set of values and a vision that can stretch across our coalition. But we cannot, in doing that, lose the energy and excitement that in the early part Jeremy brought to the Labour Party, brought new energy and new voters, breaking with politics as usual. Now, for Keir to talk about competence is absolutely right. It's correct, it's important, but it's not exciting. And I think we need to move on from that. Now, in terms of the values debate, I mean, obviously family, fairness, hard work and decency very much have a apple pie quality to them. I mean, I think even in the massive attacks on Corbyn, no one said he was particularly anti-family. So one has to invest these ideas with some content. And I think the same is true regarding the arguments around patriotism. I'm not one of those who are sort of nihilistic about this argument or feel that it's illegitimate to use that term. I mean, I thought Rebecca Long-Bailey was right in the leadership election to talk about progressive patriotism, and I think it's regrettable that so many people on the left, or a significant number anyway, really regard that as an abomination. But I do think if we're to use it and use all these ideas that really, in principle, aren't political dividing lines, because no one ever stands for indecency or laziness or or anti-family. They have to be infused with a Labour progressive content. If one's image of patriotism is simply to mirror the conventional one, well, that's okay. That may help get you some votes back someplace. But a lot of people, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't resonate. Doesn't the whole flag waving means absolutely nothing to them, and those are people that we can't afford to lose either. Now, I think in terms of the sort of trying to leave the culture war behind, again, Keir is broadly doing the right sort of thing. I mean, the position on Brexit or the Brexit endgame that this is now done. I think that's a position that Labour should have been taking in 2017 and 2018. Or by 2019, frankly, it was too late. That position would not have held by that stage. But I think on that, and in his apparent willingness to have a possibility of a second referendum on Scottish independence if the next Scottish parliamentary elections give a mandate for that. He is getting the Labour Party back on the right side of democracy, the democratic argument, letting people decide and respecting their decisions. Doesn't mean Labour should be in favour of independence or even necessarily in favour of a second referendum in Scotland, but it has to allow for the possibility. And I think these are things that are opening up space by moving on from those divisions to try and allow Labour to recapture ground. But even that won't be enough. If Labour was to win back all the red wall seats we lost last year, all the Scottish seats we lost in 2015, we would still be short of an overall majority in Parliament. So we have to be breaking through into new areas on the basis of a platform that can have that appeal. Now, if one talks about a vision, it's not something I think that any politician has ever just been able to suck out of the end of their thumb. It's not. Visions don't arise like that, or if they do, they tend to be rather dangerous and disturbing. One has to look to mass movements, to the empowerment of people at the grassroots, to actually generate the issues, the demands, the struggles that start to give shape to a vision. Partly that means a much stronger trade union movement than we have at the moment. I mean, a lot of the red walls seats were lost to Labour politically after they were lost to the Labour movement industrially through economic change, basically, a generation or more earlier. And if we look at the mass movements of this century, there have been, I think, 4 on the left that have had significance. There's the anti-war movement, mainly around Iraq, the anti-austerity movement that encompassed UK Uncut, Occupy, People's Assembly, and so on, Black Lives Matter, and the climate change and Extinction Rebellion. Those are things that have engaged masses of people and are sort of defining the parameters of a progressive agenda. It was one of the strengths of Corbynism that it came from that spirit of the mass movement outside Parliament. And it was a weakness that those movements tended to fade away once the leadership of the Labour Party had been won, leaving Corbynism relying on parliamentary work and parliamentary leadership, which frankly wasn't its strength at all. But those sort of campaigns and the issues they represent are the skeleton of a government committed to social justice and change. I hope that the Starmer leadership stays open to those movements and the agendas that they are promoting, that it gives them appropriate policy shape. And I'm a great fan of Claire Ainsley, I would say, who I worked with at the T&G for many years. And any idea that she's a right winger is very far of the mark. But I think if we can keep open to that spirit of mass struggle, if we can, I agree with Paul about it's about these struggles challenge powerlessness. They're not the answer to it on their own. That challenging powerlessness needs more institutional forms at work and in the community, as well as mass movements of protest. But they do also generate some of the spirit of excitement, which I think Labour does need, spirit of political excitement, to get from 32 to 44%.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So, I mean, let's bring back all the speakers now. It'd be great if any of you have any responses to anything you've heard. So Andrew is talking about how do we reignite the energy of the mass movement that came up underneath Corbyn but dissipated once he became leader. Is there any chance of reigniting that spark under Starmer? What would that look like? Or if any of you want to respond to any of the points that others have made. Paul, please.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to talk specifics around the place I come from, Lee. So I'm just looking at the figures. 2017 general. This is in response to what Andrew and Hazel have said. 2017, we got 26,000 votes, and we had a 9,000 majority. 2019, we got 21,000 votes, sorry, 19,000 votes, and we lost. So Lee is winnable back. But just to get people's heads around what the scale of the problem is. Many of TWT's activists will be people who go out and do street stalls and this kind of thing in elections. The Labour Party held a grand total of 1 street stall in the entire election in Lee, my hometown. And it lasted 90 minutes, and it was on the last Saturday before the election. There were visits. There was a visit from the Ian Lavery's battle bus. But in terms of what the party did, why? Because of the extreme hostility to us by the people who frequent and live near the town centre. So the MP said to me, we're not making me, Joe Platt, a big feature of this campaign because so many people are hostile to me personally. Now, we need to realise that that's the kind of sea that we are swimming in. People would come up to us and say, I want to say something to you, but you won't listen to me. And we say, come on, you can say anything you want. And they said, I want to round up all the Romanian migrants and their children, slam them in a van and take them to Dover, and I don't care what happens to them next. So this is ethnic cleansing ideation, right? So I raise this because as a journalist, I hear this all the time. In some of the places we need to win back, and some places we'll never win. So we need to be really clear-eyed about what the problem is that we're dealing with. Now, in that town, at the same time, young people who are probably the sons and daughters of the people who don't like us were running out of their houses. So one woman ran out in her slippers to take leaflets in December and came with us. There is just a huge generational divide. And I think that what I would welcome, the wisdom of the crowd here, is what experience do we have where it's been successful, where we're able to tip the balance so that the enthusiastic, young, globally connected, networked people are able to sort of step out onto the street and campaign about something that they can be proud of, that then begins to shift that middle ground in a town like that back towards us. Because I think that is what Starmer, as you say, Andrew, buys you some things. He buys you kind of the respectability and the kind of professionalism thing. But we're facing in that town, and many like it, that we're up against a right-wing utopia. You know, white nationalism, QAnon, or plandemic, masks are Marxist. This is what you'll hear if you go out now. What I agree with Andrew that without a vision, there's nothing to excite people in those streets other than you're left replacing the kind of bread and butter offer with just an offer on competence, and that is my clear difference with Starmer right now. We need a vision, because only visions of the future are what these ideological battles on the high street of Lee, main street of Lee, are about visions of the future.
Thanks, Paul. I just want to read out, I got a couple of interesting comments from the chat. Sorry, Hazel, did you want to respond to Paul then?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things. So, like, firstly, I don't think that street stalls, I'm not saying you're saying this, by the way, but street stalls and I think door knocking don't actually win us elections. They're good for helping get out the vote and doing some voter ID, but the idea that we actually massively convince loads of people on the doorstep, in a couple of weeks up to the election, I think is a bit nonsense. And I think what we need to do is to give people the tools to have these conversations themselves. And what I'm going to actually lean on to explain this is that in Ireland, where I'm from, the Republic of Ireland, we've had 2 huge referendums that have seen a sea change in public opinion since 2015. We had the 2015 equal marriage constitutional change, and we also had the repeal the 8th vote. And Ireland is often seen as like this really Catholic country, like deeply Catholic country, and yet we managed to vote by a huge popular opinion in every single county in the whole country for a woman's right to choose, and that's such a sea change that happened, and one of the main reasons that happened was because people had conversations and they shared what it meant for them personally, and that's how things change. And if you look at we need to be able to give young people and those people who are excited the tools of hope but also have a message that's going to generate hope and a sense of hope for the people they're trying to convince too, you know, and then that's how that happens. And in if you look at the 2014 referendum in Scotland, like the Labour Party or narrative, or the you know, the narrative for being pro-union was very tightly controlled, whereas actually if you look at the kind of the campaign techniques that were employed by the yes side, they were, you know, they allowed different groups to kind of spur, you know, come up and deliver their message as well, and it wasn't as tightly controlled. And I think that we need to do that as well, and we need to give people the tools to convince their own families and things. I think that's important, because it's not something that we're going to put on a leaflet, you know.
Thanks, Hazel. Yeah, Andrew, please come in.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of pick up on the point Paul was making about Lee, I read a very interesting letter, it's surprising to say it, from Ian Wrigglesworth, who used to be a Labour MP, then he became an SDP MP in the 70s and 80s. He was an MP on Teesside, and he wrote in the letter to The Guardian in the aftermath of this most recent election that anyone who's represented these areas knows that there was a considerable number of working class people who held right-wing or even very right-wing opinions, but who nevertheless voted Labour because of prevailing class culture in those constituencies. And so, well, I'm not denying that we have a problem that is getting worse. It's getting sharper in places, in industrial communities in Britain, as in much of the rest of the world. There is what has changed is there used to be a hegemonic position of the Labour movement and its organisations, which meant that even what one might call, again, it's not a phrase I like, but more backward sections of the working class, people with more backward ideas who'd absorbed racist or chauvinistic ideas, nevertheless felt themselves within the Labour framework, and voting for the Tories was inconceivable. Now that hegemony has been shattered. The institutions that maintained it, trade union branches linked to big workplaces, have all gone. How do we? I mean, it would be best, of course, if we could convince everyone with racist and chauvinistic ideas to lose them. And of course, we have to do that work. We have to challenge that. But we also need to create a sort of Labour hegemony, which will have to rest on some pillars of the old, but also new pillars as well, to actually create, I think, in many communities, a sense that Labour is the party. And I mean, one of the problems, I imagine, with street stalls in Lee and other words, is how the constituency parties have been hollowed out over a very long period as union branches have disaffiliated, work has changed. The Corbyn membership surge was hugely unbalanced. I mean, obviously, it's great to have members wherever they join, but I was quite surprised to learn that there were as many Labour Party members in the southeast of England, where at that point Labour had 8 parliamentary seats, as there were in the northwest of England, where at that point Labour had 54 parliamentary seats. The number's gone down now. So I think this work to create a sort of a hegemony around organisations that people can identify with, movements, including trade unions, of course, is a critical part of overcoming this.
Thanks, Andrew. So some interesting comments in the chat here, which I think are pertinent to what you've just been talking about. So Warren Ellison is saying that unless we can demonstrate we can engender change at a local level, working class people won't turn out to vote. We have to walk the walk, so to speak. And also from Sarah C, the Union Jack stuff is a major turn-off for the Scottish voters that Starmer needs to win back. So some interesting points there. I don't know if you've got anything to respond to either of those comments. There's some questions as well. There's some interesting questions here from Ian Crompton. Can the experience of powerlessness and the crisis of democracy that underpins this be addressed by a shift in Labour with an emphasis on democratic participation, electoral reform, including PR, to something that we've been hearing quite a bit since December? Does anyone want to come in on that? Paul, thanks.
Yeah, I think that Andrew used this word again associated with Antonio Gramsci, hegemony. Let's call it, cultural influence. And the question is, can we? I think it comes down to, can we achieve this through what we do, through activism? I think we have to do something more. So without getting too historical, the problem that the Italian, during the rise of fascism, the problem the Italian working class had was that it needed to reach out to the middle class and above all to peasants who weren't hearing its message. And Gramsci, after they'd been defeated by fascism, basically coined this term hegemony, because I think it's what he meant by it is, we, the class conscious section of the population, have to make a kind of offer that includes some concessions to the ideas of and the obsessions of other parts of the population. Now, and I think it's going to take us, so people like TWT, Momentum, the Socialist Campaign Group or whatever, to say we need to make an offer to the places in the red wall that we need to win that actually feels to us like a concession. And I think it's going to be a bigger concession than using the Union Jack. No, I don't know what it is. I just add one thing to what Andrew said as well. It's worse than the idea that the labour movement has collapsed in places, i.e. the industrial wing of the labour movement. It's worse than that. I've got friends in the town I come from, and basically there is no centre. In the sense that the labour activism is the soft left and Momentum, and conservatism doesn't really exist. What exists is the remnants of UKIP and the Brexit Party and the BNP. And my friends describe sitting in working men's clubs. In one corner is the left, in the other end of the room are fascists, basically. And the problem is they are radical. So that it's not like they are the old conservative strike-breaking, cap doffing, good on your honour type people who our father's generation were up against, strike breakers. It's people who think they are in a way revolutionaries. And you'll hear it said, when's the Civil War coming? When's the race war coming? This is now, of course, these people are not a majority by any sense. They're an absolutely tiny minority. But the struggle for hegemony for progressive ideas has to understand that we're up against an extreme form of right-wing populism, and we don't seem to have come up with an answer to it. And I think, in other words, to answer the question, it's not just going to be about campaigning around things that are motherhood and apple pie. It's actually about taking difficult issues into the public space. And I think we're very, very ill-equipped for doing that. And for exactly the reasons that both of the other speakers have said about how slimmed down our operation is in the places we need to win.
Thanks for that, Paul. So, I mean, there's an sorry, Hazel, did you want to come in on that, please? Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that we're in danger sometimes of thinking that this is a uniquely British problem, when actually, the same thing is happening across most of the Western world. It's also happening in the States, and it's happening, even in countries like Sweden, where the Swedish Democrats are a major challenge for in the next election. And Sweden is one of the probably most socially progressive countries in the world. So, I and kind of resonating back on what Andrew said, I don't think, for example, that I think, for example, Donald Trump, for example, won the US election, not because he was racist and sexist, but despite the fact that he was. Because people cared more about the sense of hope that he represented for them in terms of their community than they were worried about any of the more negative aspects to him, And I think we have to kind of divide that off. There are, and I'm not saying that there aren't people who are sexist and racist and vote for Trump for those reasons. Of course there are, but we have to talk about the voters that we want to win over. And people will prioritize certain things, and the number one thing that they most of the time prioritize is economics, in the sense that their jobs and their future and their ability to to pay their way through life, and that has to be the number one thing that we try and address. And I don't think that things can fall apart really quickly, but they can also be built really quickly as well. Like Labour got its highest ever election results in a Westminster election in Scotland in 2010, and then got near annihilated in 2015. And so, yeah, like I don't think that there's a foregone conclusion of, oh well, like the Tories have got like such a huge vote, there's no way we could possibly ever win the next election. Like we just have to start, like, how are we building the foundations for how we are going to win the next election, and what are we actually prioritizing? Because we can run through every single problem and every single variable for why people are voting the way they vote, but actually we have to get realistic and appeal to the most important ones. And that is what are people's economic future. I mean, there's a reason why the UK maybe was ahead of other countries in Western Europe, and that is because income inequality in the UK grew and is bigger than any other country in Europe. And that happened when we had a Labour government. And there is a link, but causation between income inequality and a sense of resources and people turning and leaving kind of like a racist agenda, like the rise of xenophobia in the country. It hasn't happened out of anywhere. Like the Brexit vote is directly linked, I think, to deindustrialization of the British economy, and the manufacturing base and the erosion of that. And the Labour Party, I think, needs to prioritise talking about that first. And we can do that. There are the routes to do that, and it's not a foregone conclusion that we would lose, but that's the thing I think we have to start prioritizing and talking about all the time, because the reality is most voters don't sit there and do a comparative analysis of your manifesto versus every other political party's manifesto at all, right? You get to have maybe your strapline for your manifesto and a few fledgling campaigns to talk about that, or policies to talk about that to get your message across. Sorry, but that's what we need to start thinking about. Like, what is that message, and what is that hope?
Thanks, Hazel. So Andrew, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to pick up on Hazel's point, because Scotland is a very sobering example. I mean, the fact that people vote SNP is vastly more benign than voting Conservative in England, or let alone Brexit Party or anything, for sure. But we had a situation, and this is something I got wrong. I think generally most of us involved with the Corbyn team got wrong. I believed that the problems in Scotland that Labour had were mainly attributed to New Labour and a particularly mediocre succession of New Labour leaders, and that once Labour at a British level was offering a radical option again, we would start to win that ground back. And it didn't happen. There'd been a shift, and you could see it coming in the referendum in Scotland, when, although Scotland voted to remain in the UK, in Glasgow, North Lanarkshire, Dundee, they voted for independence, core working class areas. And even in 2017, our uptick in the vote in Scotland for Labour was very anemic indeed compared to England and Wales. So there is a danger there that, once people shift their orientation to believing, in the Scottish case, a significant section of working class people, that the social aspirations can be better achieved, through independence and so on, getting that back is much more difficult, certainly than I thought. And my fear is that the same problem could apply in a much less benign way in red wall seats, that once people have made this shift. And I think, the answer is that there's lots of interesting questions coming through. But this is why, when I said I think Keir Starmer, he needs to invest some of these slogans like patriotism and fairness with a concrete Labour essence to win back at least some of it, or fragment or confuse the people who are sitting in one corner of Paul's Working Men's Club, the far rightists. Now, some of those are probably never going to be any one back at all, but one has to have a narrative that can head off them expanding their reach. And I'm not sure that where we are yet is it. I mean, it's been a start in the right direction. I mean, one of the questions been asked is constructive opposition a good goal? Well, I don't want to criticise at all basically how Keir has handled the pandemic. I think it's a unique situation, and he had to find a tone, and the government has given a lot of opportunities with their blundering for him to score points. But he will need to move on. It's not going to be enough. Constructive opposition isn't enough. I mean, if you look at the template, Labour served under Churchill, but at the same time they were building the space, the vision for a radical alternative that, of course, Churchill himself was never going to deliver. And so I think, I think Labour will need to move beyond the constructive opposition phase pretty soon if it is to have any chance of building a movement that can get the people in Scotland who've left Labour to actually take a second look. Because without them doing that in Scotland, there won't be a Labour majority government next time. And that's almost inconceivable, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Andrew. So I think we've got an interesting question here in the chat, especially as we've been talking a little bit about what is essentially sort of a radicalisation of the Republican Party, who arguably have absorbed and co-opted sort of the Tea Party movement demands. Tory government now, who arguably are absorbing and adopting a lot of the positions of Britain First. We have radical views that aren't destructive. How do we reconcile having radical views, like wanting a post-work society, which I think was mentioned earlier, with campaigning for what looks like will be a fairly moderate Labour government? I mean, this is something that a lot of Labour members are really grappling with at the moment. And we know there's a real danger of people leaving. What are people's thoughts?
Well, I think, I don't know who to attribute it to, but someone said that, or made the comment that the Tories do a very good job of selling conservative ideas and making them look radical, and we do sometimes the opposite. I mean, yeah, like the Labour Party, I think we need to have more of a sense of a narrative to talk to people about. Like, we can't just be reactive all the time. I think too often in the last Parliament we were just reacting on the spot. Individually, we weren't building a long-term case for where we were trying to take people. I mean, to lean back on what we said about Scotland, like, that didn't just happen overnight. Like, I think if you look at the Scottish vote for independence, you can break it down in two ways, right? There was always about a 20% support for independence. For those people, independence is the ends, right? They just want independence, nationalists. Then you had another 25% of the vote that got added to that, and those are people who want to live in a more socially just Scotland, right? And they were the traditional voter base, and a lot of them actually are Irish, like former Irish communities, and communities of Irish immigrants that live in Scotland, who like the Scottish Catholic vote, who moved over. And I don't think for them independence was the end. For them, independence was the means. It became the vehicle for which they would get this delivered. And now the problem that Scottish Labour has is that those people have become so convinced that the only way to achieve that is through independence. But it's still not the ends that they're looking for, And if we wanted to win back some of the vote, then we have to be able to differentiate between that percentage and between the two groups. I think the only way that Labour, by the way, is going to have any chance of winning back in Scotland is if we get into government in Westminster first and show that those things can be achieved through that. I think if that step doesn't happen that way, then I do think Scotland probably is lost. But there's loads of different variables in that. Scotland has constitutionally always been its own country and its own mindset, and that does make a difference. There's a reason why, for example, Liverpool hasn't declared independence yet, or Manchester, or parts of different boroughs of London. They don't have historically had that context, which is also important. And I think we need to understand the drivers behind why people are doing that, and that's coming back to the difference between, there are people who are in the Tory party who are having messages that resonate with the likes of Britain First. But, I used to work for an anti-fascist organisation, and sometimes you'd have these massive EDL marches, right? And I remember once, and actually not just once, but on a few occasions, the EDL would turn up to some places to fight the anti-fascist movement. No anti-fascists would have turned up, and they'd end up fighting each other, and actually you have to be able to differentiate between the people like Stephen Yaxley and the people who are just kind of bored and don't have a sense of purpose and are just kind of going along with the crowd. And we can't just, wipe everyone off with the same slate, or think that there are big important differences between the two. There are the people in UKIP who actually sell this, like disgusting narratives, and then there are people who get convinced that that's the means, and we need to be intelligent enough to be able to differentiate them and have a message for the ones that we know that we can win back. There's a difference. There are people who are sexist and xenophobic who vote for the Tories, and there are people who vote for the Tories despite the fact that they're sexist and xenophobic. And which ones are we trying to talk to? And we need to be able to have a message for them, and we need to be able to have and our job is to find a more hopeful vehicle for them to achieve the country they want to live in than's been provided by the opposition. But that we have to understand the differences between the groups that exist within them. They might all be voting the same way. That doesn't mean they're all thinking the same way, or they're all voting the same way for the same reason.
Thanks, Hazel. Yes, please, Paul, come in.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that the way that Starmer's team think about this is something that at this level I agree with. Policies aren't what's going to win the election. What is going to win the election is a simple narrative, a simple story that people sign up to. Now, however, I think it's fairly clear that if you want to look for where is policy going to be formed under Starmer, it is around. The people who are influential are Claire Ainsley herself with her book. It's worth reading. I don't agree with the analysis in it, but I think there's interesting stuff in it. Jonathan Rutherford from Soundings magazine, and then the people around the foundational economy, the Manchester Business School, lefties. That's where I think they're going to kind of be. I think there's an interesting debate for us who've supported the Green New Deal for how do we frame fighting for the Green New Deal in that context. But to answer the question on radical policies, I think what we came up against in 2019, apart from Brexit, was the question of social conservatism in the small towns, the question of Scotland, and then there's a third thing. And this hit me. I was canvassing in the former area where Longbridge used to be the car factory, Birmingham Northfield, and so many people said to me, well, they kind of intimated that what they feared was change. But even though they were desperate for some an improvement in what do they not like? Parking. What else don't they like? Crime, antisocial behaviour, lots of things they don't like. But the moment you say to them, "Well, we got," if you say to them, "Well, we can bring a big change to your life," they said, "Oh no," implicitly, "No, that scares me." And I think that we haven't properly understood how deeply neoliberalism has inculcated the sense of fatalism. Wilhelm Reich, the Marxist psychologist in the 1930s, called this fear of freedom. People want freedom, but when they see it offered, they kind of recoil. No, I think the art of the policy formation is going to be solving that problem. And actually, there is in the arsenal of social democracy, and actually, in the arsenal of British social democracy as well as international, there is this concept of the maximum and minimum program. Lots of my old Trotskyist friends would not like that. They want something better than that. But I'm quite happy for us to spell out a minimum program that we're trying to create an electoral coalition around, and a maximum program that does include for me things like shorter working week, not just decarbonisation, but post growth. We on that wing of the party, can't think that we're going to get that in one leap by 2024. Winning the election would open up a space to debate things like the future of work, the future of automation, etc. But I think that so I'd be very happy if we were to conceive of the minimum that we're offering. But coming back to the whole theme, that minimum has got to be inspiring. It's got to. I know people hated the slogan "real change." The weirdest thing is it tested very well in the. That's why they adopted it. Andrew, you might have a different view on this, but I heard that's why it was adopted. The problem is you've got to concretize real change into people's lives. I'm not suggesting, by the way, we re-adopt it. It's just that that's really what we're fighting for.
Andrew, please, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, Paul, just on that last point Paul raised, yes, it did poll very well, and I think it shows the limitations of being driven by polling alone. I'm not saying it has no way, but for the many, not the few, was a much better slogan, and with the benefit of hindsight, we should have stuck with it. People knew what it meant. We don't have to be new every 2 years, frankly. The other point I just wanted to make is I don't think it should be fatalism, to come back to the question that was asked about the next being a moderate Labour government. Yes, I mean, clearly Keir Starmer is not Jeremy Corbyn, and he won't lead, in my view, a government that is as radical as a Corbyn-McDonnell government would have been. I think that's just a fact. However, we shouldn't be fatalistic about the nature of the next Labour government. We have to get that next Labour government. It will be better than the Tories. That is the bare minimum baseline. But people can shape this for themselves. If we have the sort of mass movements developing around the sort of issues I'd mentioned earlier, if we are, if this vision, we can't wait for Keir Starmer alone to, as I said, suck a vision out the end of his thumb. It needs to come from people's own struggles and activities. And if we have, I mean, in the old days, much only when I was young, you'd be looking for strike action, industrial militancy would contextualise to a large extent what a Labour government might be doing. But that's not likely to be the case for Keir Starmer. But if people are building from the bottom up movements that are addressing inequality, that are addressing poverty, that are addressing racism and climate change, that will contextualise, because it is wrong to see. I don't think Keir Starmer is Tony Blair. He's not Jeremy Corbyn. He's not Tony Blair either, who is consciously setting himself against the demands of the left at a time when the left have been historically defeated on a world scale. So it's easy for him to do. But consciously cutting against that, and consciously almost disengaging from his own party and its traditions. Keir Starmer is not, in my reading, like that. And therefore, if we have a context of basically popular agitation and militancy, that, as much as Claire Ainsley, who I admire, that will shape the nature of a Labour government.
Thanks, Andrew. There's an interesting question here from Liam Miller, which I think chimes with what you've just been talking about how do we affect change from the bottom up. Liam asks, what do those institutions that uphold progressive Labour movement hegemony look like? On what sort of timescale can they be established? Any responses to that from Liam? Paul? Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. I think it's bearing in mind the political scale of some of the places we're talking about is small. So what would a movement look like? It looks like a few hundred people turning out to do something over several months. It's not, I mean, BLM, where I live in South London, the Vauxhall demonstration was on my doorstep. I've been involved in anti-racist politics in this area for 30 years. It was the biggest black demonstration I've ever seen. So, so for example, in 1995, when the police killed somebody, a black man, we had 1,000 people. We couldn't even stop the traffic. And this was 30,000 people. But in a place, and it's not even the small towns, it's the edges of big cities as well. Those movements will they'll look quite small scale. Example, Partisan. Partisan's a social centre in Salford. It's run by sort of autonomous anarchist left, Labour affiliated. It's an absolute tip. It's a kind of falling down building. It has raves. It's a place where people can organise. The small town I come from hasn't even got anywhere like that. And I think that we should think very carefully about place. You'll remember, Andrew, in the 80s, when the mass unemployment, the Labour movement set up unemployed centres in quite a lot of towns. And this was something that the GMB at one point were talking about doing, but I think it fell by the wayside because the General Secretary changed. centres. I think it's rather than what they do, the fact that there is a place and a space is going to be really important. But bear in mind, say again, yes, the fascists are tiny, but as soon as we set those places up, that will be the focus of their attention, because it's hegemony only means influence. It just means there's a place to go. There's a billboard on the door. You know, again, Sony, because of the Joe Cox situation in parts of Northern England, MPs don't advertise where their offices are. So I think space, and then what you do is you respond to whatever's going on. It could be employment. I think it is going to be unemployment in the next few years. I think it could be domestic violence is a huge issue in some of the places we're talking about. So I think, yeah, it's place to organise from, and what you organise can change.
Thanks, Paul. Andrew, do you want to come in on that?
Well, yeah, because I think the questioner was reacting to something I'd said about the re-establishment of the sort of hegemony that Labour had in generations past in industrial areas. That, again, very much grew out of work and the organised. I mean, these places. It was organised Labour that held these places. The Labour Party was just a part of that, really. And I agree with what Paul has just said, and I also think there is no easy answer to the question. Yes, trade unions are still there, but it's not got the weight it had in the past. Trade unions do need to be strengthened. I mean, one of the silver linings in this enormous coronavirus-shaped cloud has been there's been a new understanding of the importance of trade unions, even at the level of a Tory government is having to sort of address unions in a new way. And I think more people are understanding the need to be in unions. Will that re-establish the hegemony of old? No. Or at least not in any of the timescales we're talking about. We also need to look about how we can intervene in the communities reaching out beyond work. Now, Unite, my union, set up a community membership scheme a few years ago. Anyone who's not in work for whatever reason can join. It's done reasonably well, but it's not done well enough. I mean, its presence is still slight in many communities, but it's a start. It's opening up the movement to people who aren't in work. The Labour Party appointed community organisers rather controversially under Jeremy. Now, there's a sort of argument as to what difference they made one way or another in the 2019 election. Probably it wasn't a great deal one way or another. But in terms of trying to turn the Labour movement into engaging with the campaigns that grow from the bottom up, it's certainly passing the buck in answer to the question. But really, people down below, they will shape the organisations that create the sort of culture, the cultural influence that as Paul puts it. And, you know, one can't from on high say what they are going to be, how they are going to emerge. They will emerge from the soil of a crisis-ridden society. Britain has now been in a crisis really for more than 10 years. When people talk about us getting back to the level of 2019 in terms of wages and living standards in a couple of years' time, they really mean getting back to the level of 2008, because we had that huge, period of stagnation. We're now looking at this perfect storm, second wave of coronavirus, a Brexit without a trade deal, that leak in the Sun a few weeks ago saying army on the streets and so on. These generate the need for people to organise and coalesce around alternatives. And as for the timescale on which this happens, I mean, it's probably very slow that it happens all at once, in a way. There's an accumulation, and then suddenly you realise you're there. I mean, I reflect on the anti-war movement of 2002 to 2004, 5. Enormous demonstrations suddenly in communities all over the country, some that never had demonstrations before, suddenly galvanized by that issue, and that really was inspiring and exciting at the time. Not successful enough, but it certainly changed the weather. So I think one can't sit here and be prescriptive about what those organizations will be or when they will emerge. One can only be indicative as to the process and the issues.
Hazel, please.
Yeah, I think that yeah, I mean there are loads of exciting new movements that are coming forward, but I think like actions don't a movement make, and yes, there's been lots of protests, for example, but how that actually gets carried forward, how does that translate into building a community and a sense of community and identity around that issue that can withstand just the initial outburst of energy is important if we want to look at how we can translate that into actual votes come election time. And I think that yes, like there are new movements. Like there's one in Scotland called Living Rent, and our union has worked closely with them in Glasgow, actually. But I want to come back to the whole bit about new institutions. I mean, we really need to just look about the ones that we actually already have, which is the trade union movement. And the reality is that there were less strikes that took place after 2008 than there were leading up to that. And the trade union movement, the reality is that most members of trade unions will swap trade union membership between, say, the big three, for example, Unison, Unite, and GMB, in the same way that they'll swap internet provider, because we've lost what that meaning is to be a member of a trade union in lots of places. It's like an insurance policy that people hold. And that's because the trade union movement has, we all bought into a massive servicing model of organizing. And a long time ago, like, the trade union movement was the movement that went out and educated people. And when I say education, I think there's this kind of idea that, well, education will just solve all these problems and everything else. And actually, well, just because we push everyone through higher education isn't going to make, that's not going to solve these issues. Like there's like, it's about getting good paying jobs, and what are the unions actually doing to deliver a lot of that? Like it'll be like the unions have had a bit of a bounce of membership through COVID, but we'll see how long that lasts when we're going to enter a massive unemployment situation. And I think our unions need to get more radical. Like we were a sense of community. Like your trade union was your community, and you did listen to people in your union. They did have those links, and they don't really have them anymore. And we need to focus on building that back up, because the Labour Party would have done a lot better if the trade unions could have gotten all their members to just vote Labour in the last election or in the next election. And we can't. The reality is that the majority of our, like, not all of our members, a huge bulk of our members are actually voting Tory. Why is that happening? And sometimes we look for the next new fix, the next new thing, and actually maybe we need to go back to basics and reestablish those relationships from the shop floor up, and give people a sense of identity. Because, like I think I said earlier, and I really stand by this, you don't earn the right to tell trade union members how to vote if you haven't, for example, sorted out the broken kettle in the canteen, or you haven't sorted out their pay deal, or a majority of other different things. But what is interesting is how we can get those institutions to work together. So in GMB in Glasgow, our refuse workers have teamed up with Living Rent to run a campaign about the local community and the state of the streets in Glasgow, instead of taking the tensions away from the two of them and combining those two different movements. I think that's something that's powerful, and that's something that we should see more of. But ultimately, I think trade unions need to focus on their job, which is workers in the workplace, and using that as a building block. And then maybe reaching out past that after they've done that to other organizations. And how can we work across organizations, instead of all the organizations that we do have trying to do a million different things all at the same time.
That's great. Thanks, Hazel. Okay, so one last final question I think we've got time for. It's quite a big one. Do the panel think Labour can win power on its own? Andrew, do you want to come in first?
Well, it's a huge stretch, to be honest. I think Hazel earlier put her finger on the root of the dilemma, that in Scotland, politics can't be reframed, or working class left wing can't be reframed until there is a Labour government in Westminster doing the sort of good things that people in Scotland, as in England and Wales, want. Yet, on the other hand, getting to that point without winning, not even, we don't need to go back to 41 seats, but say getting back to 21 Labour seats in Scotland, well, getting to an overall majority is very, very difficult. I mean, we are 3 or 4 years away from that election, so there's no need to be too gloomy about it. But I don't think Labour should be afraid of the possibility of having to govern with some sort of arrangement with the SNP. Liberal Democrats would be a different matter altogether. I certainly wouldn't advocate that at all. But I think we have to work for a Labour majority government. I mean, I thought even before the last election that we had to be open to an alliance with some arrangement with the SNP, had we been in a position to. Not because even if we'd had a small majority, frankly, I would rather have relied on an agreement with the SNP than an agreement with the far right of the PLP, which would have been very unstable, and you've been living from vote to vote. So it'll be a different situation. We've got to go for it, but we also have to be realistic. I think that without a change in Scotland, we're looking at winning a Labour majority in England and Wales on its own, and that has happened, but doesn't happen very often.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that, Paul?
I mean, I think Labour, even if it could, I wouldn't want it to, because the scale of change we want to be able to, enact in Britain needs. When we talk about scrapping neoliberalism and changing to something completely different, if you think about the way the 1945 government ushered in a Keynesian, a kind of took the wartime economy and turned it into a peacetime Keynesian state capitalist economy, that effectively created a two-party consensus around the future. And I mean, we owe it to the next generation to at least create a consensus around zero carbon. And I think that, so although, I wouldn't fetishize trying to form a government with the Lib Dems, I would certainly say we shouldn't be frightened of a government that has the Greens, Plaid, SNP, as natural partners for it. And I would actively seek a power offer, whether we, however many of the seats we claw back, that tries to engage them in a transformative thing for United Kingdom. The obstacles to winning on our own, though, are absolutely huge. And I would agree with Andrew that, we'd have to be prepared for a supplying confidence or whatever. The only point I would say is that, and I'm sorry to leave this until the end because we might disagree with it, is that I don't see the liberalism as the main enemy. I see neoliberal economics as the problem, but the main problem for us is authoritarian nationalist, white nationalist, racist, misogynist reaction. And I think that all over the world, you are seeing some liberal parties now come to the conclusion that the time has now come to decide which side they're on, against the Trumps, against the AfD in Germany. And so, I'm not sure the Lib Dems will revive, actually, but if they don't, this is the final heretical thought. Labour needs to be able to include liberals. It needs to be able to small L liberals. There needs to be, we might not agree with them, but they've got to be somewhere.
Thanks, Paul. Hazel, do you have any final points on that?
Well, I mean, I think it'd be very difficult for Labour to get into a majority from where it is at the moment. Do you think it can win power on its own? I don't think that's just about in terms. Wouldn't interpret that question as being just about the other political parties in the political system. Actually, I don't think you can have a strong Labour Party without a strong Labour movement, and I don't think you can have the other way around either. And so in that sense, I don't think it can on its own at all. I think it's, there are going to be people who are tuning in now who aren't members of the Labour Party, and actually Labour still needs them to help in some way as well, which is just by going into those communities and building a sense of community in a way that we can actually talk and have a safe place for people to have these conversations about Labour. Give people the tools to talk about the kind of wired narrative, like Paul said, like I think we've all said, what is the story that we want to tell people, and what is that kind of brighter future? And people might have different interpretations of how to get there, but like if that's the push factor, then I think, you know, Labour can win in on that. Mathematically, I think they'll have to have some sort of agreement with the SNP, but here is the difficulty. You know, in 2015 at Miliband, the Tories like whipped up fear about in Middle England about these, you know, about the Scottish voters in the SNP, and used that to kind of generate like a massive vote for the Tories in England, when actually, you know, that's a kind of double obstacle we're going to have to come over. You know, how do we sell a British vision and also not alienate lots of voters in Scotland, or alienate the SNP, for example? You know, are we going to lose seats when, you know, to Tories because there are voters who are worried about the fact that we might go into coalition with the SNP because we have, you know, we're existing in this kind of xenophobic environment? Like I don't actually know what the answer is to that, but it is something that we're going to have to come up against. I would 100% vote for a coalition that involved the SNP, because I think it's about pushing things in the right direction, and they're certainly, you know, less toxic than the Tories are, you know. But we will have to build a coalition. How are we going to convince Green voters to still vote for the Labour Party in some key constituencies? You know, are we going to have electoral coalitions? I don't know. Like, I don't think Labour can win it on its own. I think it's going to take a huge thing. But the win isn't just the Labour Party. The win is a better country for us all to live in, and maybe there are different vehicles to deliver that, but we need to try and unite them as much as possible. It's about building a consensus, I think, for change, you know, and then Labour's job is to capitalise on that and convince people that it's the best vehicle through which to deliver it.
Great, thanks, Hazel. Well, that's a relatively hopeful note to finish on, which is nice. Thank you so much to our brilliant speakers today, Andrew, Hazel and Paul. Thank you to everyone who's attended today. Just a couple of things to continue the discussion today. We've set up a dedicated space on our community forum. If you've already set up your account, you can click on this link to the chat. Click on the link in the chat to find a relevant discussion thread to this event. If you're registered for the festival, check your email for your sign-up link to the form. Finally, another plug. If you enjoyed this session and the festival and would like to help us sustain our ongoing work, please consider supporting us at theworldtransformed.org/support. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Take care. Bye.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.